In the 1960s, El Salvador and Honduras were under military dictatorships, and initially they had good diplomatic relations despite their centuries-old land disputes. They were both part of the Central American Defense Council, which was aimed at crushing left-wing political movements in the region. They were also in the Central American Common Market, which reduced trade barriers, and in 1967, the two nations ratified a treaty on immigration. However, there was a stark difference between the countries. First of all, El Salvador had a far stronger economy and benefited from being in the Common Market, while the weaker industry of Honduras suffered under it. Also, both nations were experiencing an increase in population, but although it was just a sixth of the size of Honduras, El Salvador had a much larger population. The strain on resources this caused encouraged around 300,000 Salvadorans to cross the border into Honduras. In Honduras, however, President Oswaldo López Arellano tried to curb growing discontent with the economy, and he gave in to pressure from domestic landowners. So, in 1969, he didn't renew the Treaty on Immigration and began to expel Salvadoran squatters from the land they occupied. Scapegoating the national pride then encouraged many Hondurans to discriminate against and even attack the Salvadorans that remained. In May 1969, the Salvadoran president Fidel Sánchez Hernández increased tensions by having photos of the attacks published. Meanwhile, the qualifications for the World Cup in 1970 were underway, and both nations had finished top of their group and were set to face each other in the semi-final. On the 8th of June 1969 in the Honduran capital, Honduras beat El Salvador 1-0. After the game, which saw violence between fans, a young Salvadoran girl shot herself after seeing her country lose. She became a national hero and was given a televised funeral, and this subsequently spurred on further violence as the Hondurans travelled to El Salvador the following week. Honduran fans were killed, their team travelled in armoured cars, their hotel was pelted with eggs, and a rag was flown instead of their national flag. El Salvador won the game 3-0, meaning the two teams had to play again in Mexico City. This final leg ended with El Salvador winning 3-2, claiming victory in extra time and progressing to the final of the qualification. However, in the aftermath of their defeat, Hondurans once again attacked Salvadoran immigrants. President Hernández blamed the Honduran government for allowing what he called a genocide and severed diplomatic relations. Then, on July 14th, 2 weeks after the final leg, with tensions still incredibly high, he sent his air force to bomb Honduras. Although the bombings targeted airfields, the Honduran air force was able to respond and deliver a decisive blow to the Salvadoran invasion by bombing their oil tanks and supply lines. Nevertheless, on the ground, El Salvador went ahead with its invasion and made quick gains, but by the 16th it became apparent with limited supplies and poor weather they could not maintain their momentum. Meanwhile, the Organization of American States had held emergency meetings and demanded a ceasefire. El Salvador initially demanded reparations, but because they were not progressing on land, they gave in to pressure and a ceasefire was signed just 4 days into the fighting. Further threats of sanctions forced El Salvador to withdraw from Honduras completely a couple weeks later. The conflict resulted in the deaths of a couple thousand people, mainly Honduran civilians. It also put a halt on the Central American integration agreements and policies for at least a couple decades. Plus, thousands of Salvadorans fled Honduras and returned home. This put further strain on the economy and land, and this in turn helped cause the El Salvadoran Civil War a decade later. And if you're interested, El Salvador beat Haiti to qualify to the World Cup in Mexico, but at the World Cup they lost every match.